In the grand halls of Pharaoh's palace, a man stands before the most powerful ruler in the ancient world, his staff gripped tightly in his hand. With a single motion, he casts his staff to the ground, and before the gathered court, it twists and writhes, transforming into a living serpent. Gasps fill the chamber, but the pharaoh does not look impressed. He gestures to his own magicians. Without hesitation, they step forward, performing the exact same feat. Their staffs, too, become snakes. This moment, recorded in Exodus 7, raises a question that most believers never stop to ask. If magic was fake, how did Pharaoh's sorcerers replicate Moses' miracle? Was this truly divine power, or was this something else entirely, a battle between rival magicians? Because if we strip away the reverence, what we're looking at here isn't prophecy, it isn't divine revelation. It's a wizard's duel, a magical showdown between Moses and the Egyptian priesthood, each side performing acts that seem, by all accounts, to be sorcery. And Moses doesn't stop with the serpent trick. He turns the Nile to blood, summons plagues, and even calls forth darkness to consume the land. If these events happened exactly as described, then we are not dealing with a prophet in the modern sense. We are dealing with a man who wielded supernatural power in a way indistinguishable from the court magicians of Egypt. The implications are massive. If Moses' abilities could be mimicked by pagans, what does that say about their source? Were these plagues really miracles from a divine being, or just an extension of the same arcane knowledge used by Egyptian priests? To answer this, we must dive deeper. Who exactly was Moses? Where did he learn these arts? And why does the Bible itself, in moments like these, blur the line between divinely ordained miracles and what can only be described as magic? Moses is often portrayed as a humble servant of God, a man chosen to deliver divine miracles. But what if his story is something far more complex, something that aligns less with traditional prophecy and more with the secret knowledge of ancient sorcery? Moses, as the story goes, was raised in Pharaoh's court. This is key because Egypt was not just a land of pyramids and pharaohs. It was the heart of ancient mysticism, a civilization that thrived on its mastery of hidden knowledge. The priests of Egypt were no ordinary men. They were scholars of astrology, alchemy, and arcane rituals that dated back thousands of years. They held the secrets of life and death, and they were the spiritual gatekeepers of the kingdom. Moses, adopted into the royal household, would have had access to this world. Unlike the enslaved Israelites, he was raised in an environment where he would have been exposed to the highest levels of Egyptian education. This wasn't just literacy and mathematics. This was an elite class of knowledge that included sacred rites, the invocation of divine forces, and the manipulation of nature through ritualistic means. Is it any wonder, then, that when Moses is first introduced as a miracle worker, he performs an act that mirrors Egyptian sorcery? He throws his staff on the ground, and it becomes a serpent. But Pharaoh's magicians do the exact same thing, proving that this was no unique act of divine intervention. It was a practiced and known form of magic within Egypt. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Moses doesn't just stop at this trick. The plagues he unleashes upon Egypt also bear a striking resemblance to Egyptian magical practices. Turning the Nile to blood, this is something that aligns with Egyptian rituals concerning the manipulation of water, particularly those associated with Sekhmet, the goddess of plague and destruction. The summoning of frogs. Frogs were sacred to Hecate, the goddess of fertility, and invoking them was within the scope of Egyptian magical arts. Darkness covering the land, an event that mimics the solar eclipses and darkening spells of Egyptian high priests. If Moses was simply channeling divine power, why did everything he do align so neatly with the very forms of magic that Egyptian priests understood and practiced? There's another detail that raises even more suspicion. When the plagues begin, Pharaoh's sorcerers are able to replicate them at first. They turn water to blood. They summon frogs. But eventually, they reach a limit. They cannot produce gnats, and at that point, they acknowledge that this is the finger of God, Exodus 8:19. This raises yet another question. If they were able to copy some of Moses' miracles, were they tapping into the same supernatural force? Was this a case of two rival magic systems competing, with Moses simply having access to a more potent version? And what does this mean for the nature of his power? If Moses' miracles were completely unique, the Egyptian sorcerers should have been left helpless from the beginning, but they weren't. They matched him for several rounds before finally admitting defeat. This is not the behavior of men facing an all-powerful divine force. It's the behavior of magicians testing the limits of their craft. What if Moses wasn't merely a prophet? What What if he was a master of an ancient mystical tradition, one that the Bible later attempted to reframe as divine rather than magical? If that's the case, then the entire Exodus story takes on a new meaning. This wasn't a contest of faith, it was a contest of magical dominance. And Moses, through whatever knowledge he had gained, managed to overpower Egypt's elite. But if that's true, where did Moses get this knowledge? And why does his story contain even more elements that link him to arcane traditions rather than straightforward prophecy? We're only beginning to unravel the mystery. Moses' connection to the world of magic becomes even more striking when we examine how he interacted with the forces around him. His staff was not merely a tool, it was an instrument of power, capable of performing supernatural feats that paralleled the magical artifacts of ancient Egypt. Consider this. In ancient Egyptian tradition, staffs were not just walking sticks. They were symbols of divine authority and could be imbued with magical properties. Pharaohs and high priests often carried scepters that represented their dominion over the natural and supernatural worlds. So when Moses wields his staff to summon plagues, part the Red Sea, and even bring forth water from a rock, he is engaging in something that looks suspiciously like sorcery, not prophecy. But the most revealing moment comes when Moses ascends Mount Sinai. The Bible tells us that he remained there for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving divine instruction. But ancient mysticism tells us something else. 40 days is a significant number in occult practices, often representing a period of intense spiritual transformation. Throughout various mystical traditions, prolonged isolation in a sacred space has been used as a means of achieving enlightenment, unlocking hidden knowledge, or communing with supernatural forces. Moses doesn't just return with moral guidelines, he returns with something far more powerful: divine laws inscribed in stone, knowledge that he alone possesses, and a transformation that leaves his face glowing so brightly that he has to veil it to avoid frightening the Israelites. This is no ordinary event. Compare this to shamanic traditions in which participants enter isolation, undergo visions, and return as powerful leaders with newfound spiritual authority. This pattern exists in countless ancient cultures, and Moses fits this mold far better than the conventional image of a prophet receiving simple instructions from God. But there's another strange detail that further aligns Moses with esoteric traditions: the claim that he had horns. The idea that Moses had horns comes from a mistranslation of Exodus 34, verses 29 to 35, where it states that his face shone after speaking with God. The Hebrew word karan can mean either radiated light or grew horns. Later, in medieval Christian art, Moses was often depicted with literal horns due to this confusion. But this raises a fascinating question. Why was the idea of Moses with horns so persistent? In many ancient traditions, horns were a sign of supernatural power. In Mesopotamian, Greek, and even early Jewish mysticism, deities and figures imbued with special knowledge were sometimes depicted with horns as symbols of divine wisdom or hidden strength. Could it be that the biblical description of Moses was not simply about a radiant face, but about a transformation, one that left him physically altered, marking him as something more than human? This ties back into the possibility that Moses was more than just a messenger of Yahweh. He may have been engaging in arcane rituals, tapping into hidden forces, and wielding a kind of power that we would now call magic. And if that's the case, then his role in shaping Israelite religion was not just about law-giving, it was about introducing an entire system of supernatural authority, one rooted in knowledge that predated even his own time. This interpretation opens the door to even deeper questions. If Moses was using practices that mirrored Egyptian and Mesopotamian mysticism, where did those traditions originate? And more importantly, was he the only biblical figure to engage in such mystical acts? Or was this knowledge far more widespread than we've been led to believe? Moses' mastery over supernatural forces becomes even more undeniable when we examine the plagues of Egypt. Traditionally, these events are viewed as divine judgments, but the mechanics of these plagues bear an eerie resemblance to the practices of ancient magic. Take the first plague, turning the Nile to blood. In Egyptian magical texts, the manipulation of water, particularly the Nile, was a known practice. The river was central to Egyptian life, and controlling it was a symbol of immense power. Even the Book of the Dead contains spells to influence the waters. When Moses strikes the river and it turns to blood, is this an act of divine intervention, or is it an ancient spell that mirrors Egyptian sorcery? And what about the magicians of Pharaoh's court? The Bible explicitly states that they were able to replicate the first few plagues, turning water to blood and summoning frogs. If these acts were purely divine miracles, how were the Egyptian magicians able to do the same? This suggests that whatever Moses was doing wasn't unique, it was a form of supernatural manipulation that Pharaoh's sorcerers also understood. The pattern continues with the plagues of hail, locusts, and darkness. In Mesopotamian and Egyptian magical traditions, priests would invoke deities to command the forces of nature. Hail and fire were associated with divine wrath in Egyptian texts. The summoning of locusts was tied to agricultural curses, and darkness, blocking out the sun, was an ultimate show of power in a land that worshipped Ra, the sun god. What Moses does in these plagues is not just about demonstrating divine authority, it's about showing that his supernatural power exceeds that of Egypt's own magicians. This is a battle of magical supremacy, not just theology, but perhaps the most chilling moment comes with the final plague, the death of the firstborn. Ancient sorcery often involved invoking death upon one's enemies through spoken words, rituals, or symbolic actions. Here, Moses declares the destruction of Egypt's firstborn, and it comes to pass. But notice how the Israelite households are spared, through an apotropaic ritual, a form of magic meant to ward off evil. The smearing of lamb's blood on doorposts is a classic protective charm, something commonly found in ancient pagan magic. If Moses were acting purely under divine command, why does he need to instruct his people in a magical protection ritual? Why does this event resemble protective spells found in Babylonian and Egyptian texts? The answer may be unsettling. Moses was using techniques that had existed long before him, not as a divine prophet but as a practitioner of supernatural arts. And if Moses' role in Egypt was this deeply intertwined with magical practices, then what does that say about his parting of the Red Sea? The Bible describes it as the wind driving the waters apart, but in many ancient cultures, magicians were believed to control the elements. There are Egyptian spells that reference the parting of waters, a motif that appears in Babylonian and Ugaritic texts as well. Moses then was not just a prophet, he was a master of the unseen forces, wielding power in ways that had been practiced for centuries before him. His acts fit perfectly within the framework of an ancient magician, using rituals, spoken words, and dramatic demonstrations to control both nature and human destiny. But there's more. His connection to magic doesn't end with Egypt. It follows him into the wilderness, where his staff continues to serve as an instrument of power, where water is drawn from rocks, and where his authority is continually reinforced through acts that blur the line between miracle and sorcery. The deeper we go into Moses' story, the harder it becomes to separate his actions from those of ancient sorcerers. And as we continue, we have to ask, was Moses truly a prophet of God, or was he a wielder of forces that predated even the God he claimed to serve? The story of Moses does not end with his dramatic escape from Egypt. In fact, his use of supernatural power only intensifies as he leads the Israelites through the wilderness. The miracles he performs, bringing forth water from a rock, summoning food from heaven, and shaping the laws of a new nation, bear an uncanny resemblance to the works of ancient sorcerers, prophets, and occult figures. One of the clearest examples of this is the episode at Mount Sinai. Traditionally seen as a divine encounter, this event has all the elements of an ancient, shamanic vision quest. Moses ascends the mountain alone, enters into a prolonged period of fasting, and then receives revelation through fire, smoke, and mysterious inscriptions carved into stone. In many ancient traditions, prophets, magicians, and mystics would seek isolation to receive divine or mystical knowledge. The process of fasting, deprivation, and then returning with new wisdom was a well-known motif among the spiritual figures of the ancient world. And what does Moses return with? A set of laws that are said to be directly inscribed by the divine. This immediately calls to mind the magical tablets and sacred texts found in other ancient religions. Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions both include stories of gods delivering sacred inscriptions to their chosen representatives. The idea of divine laws carved into stone is not unique to Moses. It was a widespread trope in the ancient world. Even after Sinai, Moses continues to use supernatural means to guide and manipulate the Israelites. When they doubt him, the earth swallows entire rebellious groups whole. When they need sustenance, he calls forth manna from the sky. When they need water, he commands it to emerge from stone. Every step of the way, he exercises control over nature in ways that align with ancient magical traditions. His staff, the same one that turned into a serpent before Pharaoh, remains a conduit for these acts, suggesting that his power is tied to a specific object, much like the wands and staves of sorcerers and mythologies around the world. And then there is the most unsettling episode of all, his death. Unlike other biblical figures, Moses does not have a normal ending. He is taken to a mountain where he sees the promised land, but he is forbidden from entering. Then, mysteriously, he dies, but no one knows exactly how. Even more bizarre, his body is never recovered. Later, Jewish and Christian traditions suggest that his body was taken by supernatural forces, and there are even accounts of the archangel Michael disputing with Satan over Moses' remains. Why would there be such a strange conclusion to his story? Why would his body be hidden? In many ancient traditions, the bodies of powerful magicians, prophets, and divine figures were either concealed, destroyed, or transformed to prevent their power from lingering. Some myths suggest that certain figures never truly die but ascend into the spiritual realm, much like Enoch or Elijah. Was Moses among them? Was his power too great to be left in the hands of mere mortals? Or did his transformation into something beyond human mean that he could not simply fade into history like an ordinary leader? Moses' story is filled with supernatural events, but when we strip away the religious interpretation, what remains is a figure who operates exactly like a magician, sorcerer, or mystic. From his Egyptian upbringing, where he would have been exposed to the highest levels of mystical knowledge, to his later years as a leader who wielded power through spoken words, sacred objects, and divine encounters, Moses stands as one of the most enigmatic figures in ancient history. Was he truly a prophet, or was he the ultimate wielder of ancient magic? The answer may depend on how one defines the difference between miracle and sorcery, between divine authority and supernatural power. But one thing is clear. Moses was far more than just a biblical patriarch. He was a man who commanded forces beyond the ordinary, shaping history through his mastery of the unknown. Even after Moses' death, his influence over supernatural traditions continued to shape religious thought. The biblical text states that no prophet like Moses ever arose again in Israel, emphasizing his unique connection to divine power. But was his legacy one of a prophet, or something closer to an ancient sorcerer king? The way Moses' powers are described aligns closely with the magic traditions of the time. In many ancient cultures, powerful leaders were believed to wield divine or mystical authority, and their relics or places of burial became sites of supernatural significance. But Moses' body was never found, adding to the mystery surrounding his death. This disappearance mirrors the legends of other powerful figures whose bodies were hidden or transported to another realm. Could it be that Moses, much like ancient mystics and magicians, was believed to transcend ordinary mortality? The connection between Moses and magic did not go unnoticed in later religious traditions. Early Christian and Jewish texts, as well as Islamic traditions, discuss Moses' miracles, but sometimes in ways that blur the line between divine intervention and arcane mastery. The Islamic account in the Quran, for example, presents Moses in direct competition with Egyptian sorcerers, much like a master magician defeating his rivals. In some interpretations, his staff, an object that transforms, summons, and commands, is likened to the wands and relics used in other magical traditions. But perhaps the most striking continuation of Moses' magical reputation comes from the mystical Jewish tradition of Kabbalah. In Kabbalistic thought, Moses is seen as a master of divine names, secret knowledge, and hidden wisdom. Some texts even suggest that he received esoteric teachings that were passed down through hidden traditions. This mirrors the way ancient mystery schools preserved their most powerful magical knowledge, restricting it to those deemed worthy. And then there is the ultimate question. If Moses was a magician, did he understand his own power in the same way modern religious followers see it? Or was he part of an older, lost tradition where divine and magical forces were one and the same? The biblical text doesn't provide a clear answer, but what it does reveal is a man who performed supernatural feats, wielded artifacts of power, and commanded nature itself. Perhaps the real story of Moses isn't that of a simple prophet delivering laws, but of a figure standing at the intersection of religion and magic, a remnant of an age where power was understood not through theology alone but through mastery of the unseen. And if that's true, then the legacy of Moses may be something far older and more mysterious than we have ever realized. If Moses' story is more akin to that of a sorcerer rather than a prophet, what does that say about the origins of biblical authority? The Bible presents Moses as the greatest prophet of Israel, but when we break down the details of his story, we see undeniable parallels to figures who wielded power through magic, not divine revelation. Consider the cultural context. Ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Canaan were full of individuals who claimed divine insight, wielding staffs, performing wonders, and using sacred knowledge to bend reality to their will. Pharaohs were seen as gods in human form, and their high priests engaged in complex rituals meant to manipulate supernatural forces. Even outside of Egypt, we find stories of figures like Zoroaster, who commanded fire, and Babylonian priests, who interpreted dreams to alter the course of history. In this world, Moses was not an anomaly. He was part of an ongoing tradition of mystical rulers, prophets, and priests who wielded supernatural power. Moses, however, is presented as unique because his power comes directly from Yahweh. But was this merely a theological justification to elevate his status? If we strip away the divine framing, we are left with a man who performed magic, carried a powerful relic, his staff, and practiced ritualistic acts to channel supernatural forces. This is indistinguishable from the work of high priests and magicians across ancient civilizations. Even the way Moses learns to wield his power is suspect. He doesn't instantly command the miracles we associate with him. When Yahweh first appears to him in the burning bush, Moses is unsure, needing signs and wonders to convince him of his own mission. He is taught step by step, much like an apprentice magician being initiated into a secret order. His staff is not merely a symbol. It is an instrument of power used with precision and intention, much like the wands and talismans of ancient sorcerers. And what about the secret knowledge he is given? The biblical narrative suggests that Moses received a revelation unlike any other, a direct encounter with the divine that granted him unparalleled wisdom. But secret knowledge was a hallmark of mystical traditions in the ancient world. Priests of Babylon, Egypt, and Greece all guarded sacred teachings, passing them down only to those deemed worthy. Moses' experience on Mount Sinai, where he disappears for 40 days and returns with newfound wisdom, mirrors this initiatory pattern. He ascends the mountain an uncertain leader and returns a master of divine law, much like mystics who underwent transformation after prolonged isolation, visions, or encounters with the divine. His ability to wield this knowledge gives him total control over his people. He enforces them with an iron grip, using divine power as justification for absolute authority. This mirrors the way religious leaders and mystical orders maintained control by claiming access to truths that others could not comprehend and backing it up with demonstrations of supernatural force. The deeper we look, the more Moses appears less as a prophet and more as a magician king. If Moses was truly just a prophet, why does he operate more like a high magician of the ancient world? His encounters with Pharaoh weren't about mere prophecy. They were displays of supernatural power. And this begs the question, if the Egyptian magicians could perform these same miracles, does that mean they, too, were using divine power? Or does it mean that Moses' abilities weren't so unique after all? The Bible tries to distinguish Moses by saying that his power was greater, that his serpent swallowed the others, but this doesn't change the fundamental issue. Moses was engaged in a magical battle indistinguishable from other forms of sorcery in the ancient world. The parallels don't stop there. All of his acts align with recorded magical traditions. Egyptian priests used staffs to perform wonders. Babylonian diviners manipulated the heavens and called upon cosmic forces to enact their will. Even Moses' call to Pharaoh, "Let my people go," echoes the invocations of exorcists and spellcasters who commanded spirits and rulers alike to bend to their demands. The Exodus narrative is deeply connected to Egyptian magical traditions, whether the authors of the Bible intended it to be or not. The plagues unleashed on Egypt reflect well-documented magical curses in Egyptian and Mesopotamian literature. The sudden darkness, the boils, the infestations, all have counterparts in ancient texts that describe rituals used to invoke divine wrath upon one's enemies. The Passover itself, where the Israelites marked their doors with blood to ward off the angel of death, is eerily similar to Egyptian protective magic, where blood and other substances were used to create divine barriers against malevolent forces. In many ways, he is an early model of the occult figure. And if Moses was a magician, rather than a prophet, this brings up an uncomfortable truth about the Bible. It means that its foundational stories rely on magic just as much as the mythologies the Israelites supposedly rejected. It suggests that biblical miracles were not divine interventions, but elaborate magical traditions repackaged under the guise of monotheism. If Moses' miracles were simply magic by another name, then the entire Exodus narrative becomes less about divine intervention and more about an ancient competition of supernatural abilities. one that mirrored the same magical traditions found in Egypt, Babylon, and other surrounding civilizations. Consider the way Moses performs his miracles. He doesn't simply pray and wait for God to act. Instead, he uses physical tools: his staff, water, blood, smoke, just like an ancient sorcerer. He enacts rituals, giving precise instructions on what to do and when to do it. The parting of the Red Sea, for example, is not simply an act of God. It requires Moses to stretch out his hand and use his staff, as if he is channeling power through an enchanted object. This is eerily similar to magical traditions recorded throughout the ancient world. Babylonian magicians wrote spells on tablets and performed precise rituals to control the elements. Moses follows this same pattern. And if Moses was simply channeling divine will, why was Pharaoh's court able to do the same? If the miracles were unique to the God of Israel, then the magicians of Egypt should not have been able to replicate them. But they did. The Bible itself acknowledges that the Egyptian priests had access to the same kinds of supernatural power. The idea of Moses as a magician also aligns with broader themes found in the Old Testament. Many biblical figures engage in practices that today would be classified as occultism. Joseph interprets dreams, a practice shared by Mesopotamian diviners. Solomon is credited with controlling spirits, binding demons, and using magical wisdom to rule. Even Elijah and Elisha perform miracles that resemble classic magical feats, multiplying food, raising the dead, calling down fire from the sky. So if Moses fits this pattern, then what we are seeing is not divine prophecy, but a long tradition of biblical figures wielding supernatural power under the guise of religious authority. This would mean that the Bible, rather than being a rejection of magic, is actually one of the oldest and most widely accepted magical texts in history, one that has been reframed to exclude competing magical traditions and rebrand its own practitioners as divinely ordained. Moses is a magician whose abilities have been repackaged and given religious legitimacy. The distinction between religion and magic is an illusion, one carefully crafted by later religious authorities to mask the fact that their foundational figures were, in fact, practicing the very arts they condemned in others. If Moses' acts were magical in nature, then the biblical condemnation of sorcery in books like Deuteronomy and Leviticus becomes hypocritical.